Hello and welcome again to our class on life, or the life and work of a preacher. Last week, or in our last lesson, we talked about some pitfalls. In fact, we've done that, I believe, for the last two lessons. And as we closed our last lesson, we were talking about pitfalls of our association or our attitude or conduct, however you want to state it, around women. Now, we may think that this is a frivolous type of thought, but it is not. I think I mentioned in our last lesson about calls that I have received where preachers were looking for a place and they were leaving the place that they were because they had, as they called it, an affair. An affair. My good preaching training or preacher brother, you don't want that on your record. You don't want it on God's record. And the only way you can prevent that is to conduct yourself, and all of us conduct ourselves around our ladies as we would want others to conduct themselves around our wives or our wife or our daughters. I mentioned that what Brother Gus Nichols, the departed, the late Gus Nichols, he used to come to Pensacola when I lived there, and he would teach. He just came down because he wanted to help us learn some things that his experience and age had taught him. And he made this statement, and I think I stated this last week, but I want to state it again. He said, "Preachers, always keep a desk or a table between you and any woman who comes to you with a question or a problem." Now, he was talking about in the office, or in the church, in your study. But he said, always keep something between you and them. If you do that, he said, you won't have to worry about misconduct. But the moment that if a woman is there for counseling and she's having problems and she starts crying, and nothing is more moving to a man than a woman crying or a lady crying, you don't get up and go around on the other side and try to comfort her. She will not do this intentionally. She will not. She's not trying to seduce you. Maybe occasionally you would find that, but she's not trying to seduce you. But she has problems, and if you go around and just put your hand on her shoulder, it is very likely that she will stand up and embrace you because she wants some comfort. Don't do that, good friends. Don't do that, young preachers. There's a difference in admiring a person and lusting after a person. When you are with the ladies of the congregation, with any one of them or several of them, conduct yourself as a gentleman. Don't try to be the life of the party, and don't, for goodness sake, if that's a good way to put it, don't use flirtatious movements or make flirtatious statements. Conduct yourself, number one, as a Christian. If you're married, conduct yourself as a faithful wife or a faithful husband. If you have children, conduct yourself like you would want your children to conduct themselves as they are growing up. Be diligent. Underline the word diligent. That means doing the best that you can, or the very best that you can. You be diligent to keep your hands off of the women in the church. Now, that when you shake hands, don't give it one of those real grasping type. Shake hands gently. And if they're there, you will have some huggers. There are some ladies that just believe in hugging the preacher or any other person they talk to while they're, going out of the services and so forth or coming in. But I have made this policy. We have or have had where I have preached and lived. We've had those kind. They're innocent as they can be, but when they take a hug, they come to, and I just put my sideways to them, and I do not have a full face-on hug. It would not bother me to do that. It probably would not bother her to do that. But why take the chance? I don't have the right to, even through garments, to feel someone else's body other than my wife. That is, some other woman, and I don't want that right. Because it's not my right, and I don't want to do it. I want to be able to, when I die, say that my wife, or about my wife or to my wife, I have never been unfaithful to you. And I took Brother Nichols' advice, and I have operated on that all these years, for 50-something years, and it's worked well for me. I believe it will work well for you. I know that we're in some do's and don'ts of a preacher and his work. We're going to we've got plenty of time to get into some positive things to do, but I want us just to listen and learn and save yourself a lot of heartache. Maybe save yourself something of a divorce, because if you have relationship with some other woman, whether it's your secretary, whether it's someone coming in to have counseling, and it is known, then it's likely going to cause a divorce. And if you hide it or keep it, it's going to eat at you like a gangrene. Don't do that. I know I've said that on some other things, but I say it on this one, and I know it's a don't. Admire the ladylike actions and looks of a woman. It is my opinion that a Christian woman, dressed as a Christian woman, ought to dress, and arrayed as a Christian woman ought to be arrayed, and however you want to describe that. I think this woman, it doesn't matter what color she is, it doesn't matter how big or how small she is. A Christian woman is one of the most beautiful creations that God ever gave to man, that he ever made. Now that is an opinion. You don't have to share that opinion, but that's the opinion I have, and I don't want to do anything to mar that type of attitude or that type of admiration. So just take this section and look at it again, read what has been said about it in the books that we've recommended, but don't involve yourself in any doubtful way with any of the women of the church. And as I think I said this last week also in the last lesson, when you have someone that's coming, and you know they're coming, or some lady coming, and they've called and want to talk to you, then if you have a church secretary, have her sit in the room. Or if you have a wife and she is not at work or something, have her sit in the room, or just one of the elders' wives or something. Someone as to do two things: to be a witness as to what goes on in case some false accusations might be made later, but mainly to protect yourself, keep you from doing those things that you might be tempted to do. So keep that in mind, young preachers, and I'll guarantee you, if you will abide by that attitude and by these principles, that you'll live a happier life, and you'll certainly live a guiltless life in the fact of guiltless in having any kind of illegal thoughts or illicit actions toward any of the opposite sex. Pitfall number 8, as I have it listed, that Brother Myers gives us. He says the pitfall of going to seed. When I first read that, I didn't quite understand what he meant. That was years ago. But when I first read it, I didn't understand what he meant, but have through the years come to understand and agree with totally what he's talking about. He says the good advice is not riding a hobby. Don't crusade for one issue of teaching. Just teach on the same thing. Some preachers teach on baptism every Sunday. The major portion of their sermon is on baptism, or it's on the first principle, or it's on something else. If you've listened to some of those that have issues about the Lord's Supper and the what the cup is, that's what they ride every time you hear them in the pulpit. Well, there's more to the Bible than just one subject. And we as preachers, we need to sit down. I think I mentioned this earlier, but I'll say it again. When you go to a place, sit down and determine to the best of your ability, after you've been there maybe 2 or 3 weeks or a month or so, then sit down and devise or just write you out a series of thoughts that you see the congregation needs, and don't make it the same thing. Diversify. Make some things sermons on attitudes. So make some sermons on biography. Make some sermons on character. Make some sermons on doctrine. Make some sermons on the church and upon Christology or about Christ. And diversify. Preach maybe 1 or 2 weeks on one subject and then go to another. You can come back always to this subject, but give the audience, give those in the audience a good menu of biblical teaching. Teach from the Old Testament. Teach from the New Testament. Teach about great men and great women of the Bible. Teach about the doctrines, and we're going to talk about false doctrines here in the future, but make you up a list of thoughts that you are going to develop as sermons, and if at all possible, stick with that. Make the sermon, develop your sermons on these thoughts, and deliver those sermons. And you will have a well-rounded congregation, and you will have people that, they won't be saying, well, not much need to go. He's going to preach on that again. And I'm not saying that it's wrong to preach on something again. If it's needed 3 weeks in a row, then preach it. But understand that people want to hear something more than just that one subject. And they need to hear more than that. They need to, they need to hear preachers or preaching on a diversity of subjects, Bible subjects, and salvation, take passages, do expository preaching. This, by the way, is to me one of the most effective kinds of preaching. It's the most difficult to do once you get it done, where you take a certain passage, maybe 3 or 4 verses, or maybe a whole chapter, and just give an exposition, not a commentary particularly, but an exposition of that particular passage and the lessons that you can learn from that. I would even suggest as a trial on that, you go to the last 2 or 3 verses of the book of Romans, the 16th chapter, and just see what it says and make you a sermon, expository sermon on that. And you'll find it works. So talk about how one becomes a member of the church. Talk about the worship of the church. Then choose another theme. Choose the Christian home, denominational era, and a host of other things. And then you will see that the congregation is more attentive to your preaching. They're more appreciative of it because you are not running something, as it were, into the ground. Now, you need diversity. You need positive preaching and you need negative preaching. We're going, when we get into the do's of our series, we're mainly on don'ts now, but when we get into the do's of our study, we're going to do both positive, or talk about positive preaching and its aspects and its desirability. And then we're going to talk about negative preaching. Now, you will run into some elders who do not want, or some congregations who do not want negative preaching. Well, if that be the case, if Paul were applying for that place, they would not hire Paul. If the Lord himself were applying for that place, interviewing for the preacher's job there, they would turn him down. To say that we don't believe in negative preaching is to say that we don't believe in a good section of the Bible, and to say that we don't really believe in most of the majority of the 10 Commandments that were given to Moses. Negative preaching has its place, and it always must be presented in a loving way as well as positive preaching. We don't want to be harsh and vindictive and ugly-spirited in either type of preaching that we do, but we want to be diligent and we want to be sincere and we want to be non-compromising. We've dealt with that before. So as you are developing your lessons and your plans of preaching for a year, and it's not a bad thing to sit down and list 52 subjects that you want to preach on, or 104 if you are going to preach Sunday morning and Sunday night, and then develop those as you see fit. But take time to do that, and don't have a list of 15 first principle sermons and one on a doctrine something and back to 14 more on first principles. If you're in the mission field, that can work, because in the mission field you have to do a lot of first principles preaching. But most of the time, you're in the state people know something about the Bible. You don't have to prove to them that the Bible is the Word of God. They may deny it in their doctrines, but they essentially believe it. So just keep that in mind. But now we come to another point that I hesitate to bring it up, but it really is necessary, something that you need to think about in your life of a preacher, and that is the length of your sermons. You will hear all kinds of jokes about he's a long-winded preacher, blah, 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 and that all his sermons are so long. And I recall the first time that I heard Brother Foy E. Wallace Jr. I met him, and he came to a meeting where I was preaching. The elders invited him, and I got to meet him, and later on I became, I think, a young friend. He was an older friend of mine. In fact, I think all of the books that he wrote, and he autographed most of them for me. But the first time I heard him preach, I had heard that he was long-winded, as some people say, and I timed him. I almost missed the time to turn him off or to check my watch. But he He preached 3 hours and 27 minutes. He was able to do that because he had something to say. As a young preacher, you probably won't have that kind of background to do that. And even if you do, you wouldn't want to do it every Sunday. You wouldn't want to do it every sermon in a gospel meeting. But how long? How long should you make your sermon? Well, it depends. My advice would be this. If the elders or the members, want a 15-minute sermonette, then I just advise you to say, thank you, brethren, for considering me, but I will keep on looking. You cannot build up a congregation of faithful people on 15-minute sermonettes. Now, if you have a 15-minute daily radio program, as I have conducted many of those through the years, then you do that because you have a radio audience that are listening to you while they're working or something like that. But when people come to the services of the Lord's church to worship on the first day of the week, they have a right to that time being used and enough time being used to learn something from the lesson. And it's going to take you longer to present the truth on something than 15 minutes. Now, if you just want to go through faith, repentance, confession, and baptism and give a passage each for it, you can do that, but that's not preaching. But it is my view. You may hold a different opinion, and that is your right to do so. But it is my view that if any eldership had ever asked me or any of the members or the men when they had no elders, that they didn't want anything over 15 minutes or 20 at the most, I just didn't care to work with them because as far as I'm concerned, and again, this is an opinion, but as far as I'm concerned, people like that have about 15 to 20 minutes a week interest in the gospel or in the Word of God. However, you don't need to go an hour and a half. Most of the time, you'll tire people out. If you, again, I'm telling you about how I do it, and it's worked well for me for about a little over 50 years, almost 60 years. My view and my habit has been to prepare a sermon, enough material for an hour, and then get it said in about no more than 35 or 40 minutes. Sometimes some sermons only need 30 minutes. Sometimes a sermon will need 45 minutes. And you have to determine, and many times I would tell the congregation, we're going to be a little longer because there's more material here that I need to present to you than I can do in 30 or 35 minutes. And they don't mind that. And they expect it. But 30, 35 or 40 minutes, in my opinion, is enough time to present a well-rounded, scriptural, understandable, and one that people can learn from type of sermon. In the second place, in your sermon preparation and talking about the length of it, consider your audience. There are elderly people who are, their bones are bare, so to speak. They're tired, or they're old. They don't have the energies that they used to have. But again, a 35 or 40-minute sermon, that they can tolerate that and stand that and enjoy it. But if you start going an hour and 15 minutes, and so on, and I'll say something about that a little bit later on on this point. But you need to consider the mothers and the babies. Don't ever this is a don't that I think you need to apply. Don't ever scold mothers for bringing their babies to worship. A lot of mothers come and they may not hear 10 or 5 or 10 minutes of what you say because they're having to tend to their babies and quieten them down and settle them down so they don't disturb the audience. But they come themselves and they bring their children. They're teaching those children by habit that you need to be there at this time. But be kind to them. Don't make them have to sit there with temperamental babies or babies that are getting restless and so on for over an hour. Don't do that unless it's just absolutely necessary. And then there are the small children. You know how restless small children are. Small children have some sort of span or attention span of maybe 5 to 10 minutes, or I doubt even that much, and then they get restless and then they come back to it. But if you keep your sermons within a reasonable length of time, people will learn something and people will be appreciative. And then beware or don't do this. Don't say, well, I know my time is up, but I've got several other things I want to say, and then continue. I'll guarantee you just lost your audience. If you couldn't say it in the 40 minutes that you had to say it, at least don't say, well, I know I've run out of time. But once you say I've run out, my time is up, but you lose your audience, at least a good portion of it. And the fellow that trained me how to preach, and he was there the first talk that I gave. I wouldn't dignify it by calling it a sermon, but the first talk that I gave, he said there's an old rule. He said that when you have finished your lesson, then close it and sit down. And he said, remember these: speak up or stand up, speak up, and then shut up. The 3 S's. And that's not a bad thought in that. And then another one that I read, and I'm sure you've heard it, and I don't know who the author of it is, about a sermon, says a sermon does not have to be eternal for it to be effective. Have something to say, not just have to say something. Once you've run out of what you've prepared, I don't care if it is 15 minutes, you might need to do a little work on getting it a little longer, and if it's too long, you might need to do a little work on getting it shorter. But once you have finished, offer the invitation and sit down. Now, in some mission fields, you don't offer the invitation because they don't know what it is. But you teach them that, at least I did, and I told them why we do that, to give them an opportunity, those in the audience, an opportunity to respond. There's nothing that says it in the Bible that after every sermon you've got to give the traditional invitation song. I always have, and if I keep my mind, I always will do that. But it's something that I think, and others think, that it is certainly not unscriptural, and it is good. It gives up the people a chance to respond to the gospel that you have just preached. Now, one other thing on this law, or this thing of looking at yourself about the women and aping of preaching, the length of sermons, is the length of your stay at a congregation. You will come to learn that there are people, and there are some elders. I think this is beginning to wane away some. But when I first began to preach, I preached my first sermon in 1959. And when I went into full-time preaching 5 years later, from that point on until I semi-retired, I guess I would say, there were those elders and those men that, well, we didn't have elders, that there were some in the church that thinks or thought that a preacher should come and stay 3 years and move on. I think they get this idea from the denominational churches that where these men are assigned to different churches, and they think that it might be a good idea for the church to ape this and let the preacher preach himself out in 3 years and then send him on and we'll get a new one. And really sometimes it takes 3 years to find out all the problems that you need to preach against and sermons that you need to encourage on. So, but there will be those kind of congregations. There will be some that will want you to stay when you need to go, when you want to go. But your attitude about the success of the church under your preaching should determine your thoughts on how long you should stay. If you go to a church and you're there for 3 years and the work is just beginning to pick up, you've done your background work and the church is beginning to pick up, there's interest, attendance is increasing, and people are more enthusiastic about the gospel and about the church, why pack up and leave? If they want you to stay, stay. And use wisdom, I'll put it that way. Use wisdom in making a determination as to whether to stay at that congregation. Now, sometimes sickness in your family. I know I have moved on a couple occasions from one congregation or a congregation that's far away from where my family, my wife's family lived, and there were times that we needed to be closer so that we could take care of them, be within 30 or 40 miles of them, and we changed congregations. And that was sort of a necessity. At least we thought it was, and still think it's a good idea. When the parents get old and unable to do things for themselves around the house, things that your dad might have done 30 years ago, he can't do now. So keep in mind your responsibility to family and so forth. But I would say, in opposition to that, if it is in opposition, don't or be very careful about choosing to move in order and simply for the purpose of getting a higher pay. Now, when you're working for little to nothing, and you'll find those, most congregations or many congregations will give you as much as they possibly can. In our modern day, they don't want to deprive you of anything, and if they're making large salaries, then they're going to want to keep you happy by, that is, if you're doing a good job, they want to keep you happy by giving you raises every now and then. But if you're working for a congregation that is growing, but mainly or most of them are people that are not what we might call top blue collar workers, but middle blue collar workers, they're making above minimum wage, but not a whole lot above that. These people need gospel preaching, just like those who are white collar people. They need the gospel. When you go into mission fields, and if you do, and we'll talk about that sometime later, but when and if you go into mission fields, you're not going to have that kind of division. Now you go to India. I've done work in India for 6 or 7 years at sometimes 5 months at a time and sometimes a month at a time. But in India, you have what is called the caste system. They say it's going away, but it's not. You have those who are very rich and you have those who are very poor. And the rich do not care anything about the gospel, and the poor want the gospel. Most of them, many of them do. And you've got to preach to these people. And even though you might get a chance to go up into the higher brackets and satisfy people who are rich with your stories and maybe your jokes and so forth, if you resort to that kind of thing. But remember, the poor people need the gospel. People like I consider myself, and maybe you, as that kind of person. We're not people who are reveling in dollar bills or $100 bills or whatever. Be careful, and what I'm making here is be careful when you think about or when you get a call that, well, come over here. We've got a good congregation, and we want you, and we'll give you a whole lot more than they're giving you. Be careful of that. Think of what it does to your family. You break up a family or break your family away from friends and your children away from lifetime friends. Just these are decisions that you in your work and in your life that you have to make. And then we want to look at one other area today, and we want to talk about the problem of visiting. We've done this before, but we want to deal with it a little bit more because preachers are expected to visit, and they ought to visit. Now, I am going to go out on a limb, and I'm going to say that the visiting is not the major work of the preacher. Now, there are some elders, and there are some members, and there are maybe even some preachers who think that I am wrong on this, and they have their right to their view, and I have the right to mine. But Paul said to Timothy, until I come, give heed to reading and to prayer and to exhortation and so forth. Give thyself wholly to them. Now, he wasn't saying don't go visit anybody, you stay behind the desk. But he said the work of a preacher is to preach the gospel. I am a preacher. I'm retired, but I am still a preacher. I still teach. But I am also a Christian. I was a Christian before I became a preacher, before I studied. And as a Christian, it was my responsibility to do what the Bible tells us to do about one another, all of the one another statements in the Bible about loving one another and serving one another and bearing one another's burdens. That is what Christians do. Christians, if you read the Acts chapter 2, after the 3,000 were added, and then we're told that they continued steadfastly in the apostles' doctrine and breaking of bread and prayers, and then they had social relationships. They went from house to house and ate together and so forth. There is that need. But just because we as preachers have a job of preaching doesn't mean that exempts us from the work of being a Christian. So we need to visit. I've heard preachers say, well, I don't visit. I spend most of my time behind my desk or in my study behind my desk reading the Word of God. I think it's great. But I think that, and again, I'm putting my opinion here, I think that they would do better if they would use some time, maybe not as much as others, but that they would use some time in visiting and just getting to know people. I I have spent many hours behind the desk, and I've spent many hours out in the community. And you don't, behind the desk, you don't get to know people. You don't get to know their needs. You don't get to know their personalities. You don't have much opportunity to say, well, how about us getting together? How would you feel about us getting together for a Bible study? And I'd like to do that. And you would be surprised if you are known in the community. They know you as a person who is interested in them, not just religiously or not just behind the desk thing, but if they know that you will take the time to come visit them, go to the hospital and visit them, sit down with them and have a Bible study, they're going to be much more interested in what you say when they do hear you preach or teach, because they know that you care. Remember, God loved, and we have that command to love also. We are never to love sin, any sin that any man ever commits, or even that we commit, but we are to love that person as God loved that person. God gave his son, and it is our responsibility as Christians to share our knowledge of that son, of the Bible, with that person for whom Christ died. So visit as much as you can. Now that can, you can go to seed on that, so to speak. One preacher said, if the elders, I'm going to read this now, he said, if the elders don't specifically give me the names that they want me to visit, I don't visit. Well, that's almost like the Pharisees and the scribes, that we will check this off. I am to do this and I am to do that, and I'll check that off and check that off. And like some Christians, well, I've heard the gospel, I've believed it, I've repented, I've confessed, I've been baptized. And as one lady in Russia said, what else you think? What else you want me to do? That's what she was saying, I've done all I'm going to do. Well, sometimes preachers give that kind of an attitude. And I believe that kind of an attitude is non-Christian. I believe, I won't say it's unchristian. I don't know if there's a whole lot of difference in non-Christian and unchristian. But I just don't believe a Christian is going to have that kind of an attitude. That, well, you may need visiting, but I'm not going to come. I guess I learned my lesson on this many years ago as a young preacher when I was at the home of another, and we were planning a fishing trip. We're going to be gone 2 days. I had my elders' permission on that, and he had his elders' permission on that. And while we were packing the gear to drive for a couple of 100 miles or something like that to a favorite fishing spot, a phone call came to him. One of the members of the church where he preached was engaged in a Bible study, and he needed some help for about an hour and a half. And the preacher said, I can't come, I'm going fishing. I believe he was wrong. I believe a soul that possibly here was one of the members of that congregation was doing personal work as we encourage all members to do, and he needed some help. I believe if it had to cancel the fishing trip entirely, it would have been apropos to do that rather than to say, well, you do the best you can. If you don't get him, well, there'll be other times. And that was the attitude that the preacher had. I did not agree with that. In fact, I did not go. I backed out on the fishing trip, and he went on his own. But that, things may not get that sticky, I guess you would say. But a preacher is a Christian. And as a Christian, he needs to fulfill the biblical injunction to visit one another. And how can we get to know the needs of others if we do not visit and have social intercourse with them. But there's an opposite side to that. And I believe one is about as bad as the other. And when I use these terms, I believe, sometimes I'm giving opinion, sometimes I'm saying I believe the Bible teaches this. And I think that in principle, this is what the Bible teaches. There are those preachers who stay on the run all the time. They're here, they're there, they're busy visiting with people. People are using them. People are taking advantage of their disposition. And as a result, when Saturday night comes, that preacher hasn't had any opportunity or very little opportunity even to look at and review a sermon that he had chosen to preach, much less to prepare one. And plus the fact that while he's gone, what's his children doing? I learned this lesson the hard way. One year I preached in 16 gospel meetings. When I came home from some of those, my children didn't even know who I was, almost. And I had a very wise person. I didn't agree with him at the time. He said, you need to take some time with your family, because if you lose your children, you've lost more than you should be willing to lose. And I curtailed. I did. I cut it down considerably, because, and as doing that, I became closer. I began to know my children and know something about their school, taking interest in their schoolwork and so forth. Don't be such a visiting preacher, one on the run all the time, that you don't have time to spend in study, and that you don't take the time with your family. And again, I will talk about vacation here just for a moment. When you go on vacation, I won't say leave your Bible at home. Of course, never do that. But you're taking a vacation. Don't go out there on a vacation hoping that somebody will invite you to preach and they'll give you $100 for the sermon. Don't do that. Take the vacation. The elders give it to you for the purpose of recreating yourself, getting away from the stress of your job. Take the vacation and enjoy it, and then come back with renewed energy. Well, in looking, we have about maybe 5 or 10 minutes. Let's look at one other subject, and then we'll let you know some of the things that we're going to be talking about in the future. But let's talk about some who need to be preached, and who need to be visited by the preacher. And we've listed these before, but sick. Now, as a preacher or as a Christian, you need to know how to visit the sick. I have been in the hospital, and there have been people, well-meaning people, come to visit me. They sit on the bed, they stay there for an hour and a half, and I'm in pain, and I'm more to go to sleep, but I don't want to be ungrateful and then just goes off to sleep. When you go visit sick people, if it's just out of surgery or they still have a lot of pain, go in. Do not touch the bed. Stand where they can see you without moving their head, which is usually at the end of the bed, and ask them how they're doing, and tell them that what you want to tell them, how they're being missed, and we're praying for you. And then just ask them, would you like to have a prayer? And they'll generally say yes, and then pray for them, and then go. Don't get into some old hillbilly tale or whatever you want to call it, of whatever's happened, and go on for an hour and a half. And I've had them do that. Learn, take a lesson or do some study on how to visit the sick. And then you need to visit members. Now, there are some members that would just as soon that you did not visit, or if you were going to come for a visit, don't let it be a drop-in visit. Make an appointment. Well, I never thought it was that I needed to have people make an appointment with me or my wife to come and visit. They were just driving by and pull in the driveway and said, "Hey, we're here. We stopped by for a cup of coffee. You got any made?" And I said, "No, but we'll make some." I enjoy that kind of visit. And most people will. Maybe some don't. But you need to visit these people, just the members, faithful members. Just because they're faithful doesn't mean that they need to be left out. And then there are new members. If you work as you should, you'll add people, or the Lord will add them to the church by your teaching of the gospel. And remember, they may have left a lot of friends in some other religious body because they learned the truth. And they're going to need to have someone to talk with, because those that they've left will turn against them a lot of times. So visit the new members. Visit those who are aged. Now, again, I'm old, and I'm 83 years old. I have a different outlook on visitors that I used to have, and I'm not cranky and old in that way, but I get tired very easily. And so if people come and they want to talk and chat and so forth, have a cup of coffee and so forth, fine. But if you're visiting an aged person, understand that he has changed or she has changed since she was 30 years old or he was 30 years old. And then make allowances. Stay a short time, maybe 5 or 10 minutes, and then, well, I just wanted to drop by and see you, and then you have a good day, etc. Go visit those weak members. These are generally in large numbers in a lot of churches. Find out who, if nothing else, find out from the elders, if you have elders, who that those that they consider to be weak, and tell them why you want to know. I want to go visit with these and cheer them up or to encourage them. Elders would be glad to write you out a list. And this is something that you as a preacher should do, and even you should encourage the members to do. Remember, go visit the shut-ins. Go visit prospects for baptism. Some member comes and say, "Well, I really enjoyed it." "Well, are you a member of here?" "No, I'm thus and so." "Well, we're glad you came. You mind if I come by and visit with you for a while?" And they'll generally say, "Well, I would be glad to have you, and you can have work up a Bible study there." But now about this, before we close, as you make these visits, and there's a purpose for this, a protective purpose as well as an information purpose. But as you go visit, you keep a booklet, a tablet, or some sort of a booklet that you have that you can have blank pages, and you write the date that you go visit this person, and you write their name down. You state how long you were there. Maybe if you want to say, I got there at 10:30 and I left at 11:30, whatever. Give some of the things maybe that you talked about, and then put on there the time of your leaving, and then just put down a few words on your attitude or your summation of what that visit did. Well, if you see that the person is not the least bit interested, make it short. If you see that they're interested, then you can stay and maybe set up a series of studies at the same time for other times. So you have a record for that, but you also have a record for those cantankerous members who think that you don't do anything but play golf and go fishing and so forth. You have a record of the visits that you have made, and then if you want to just be, well, a little sly, You can say, have you visited this many people this week? And it quietens them down a little bit. We're going to talk about now, well, in our next lesson, we're going to talk about some positive things. We're going to talk about things that we've just talked about your life and your work with the congregation. Now we're going to talk about your preaching. We're going to talk about calling names and preaching the gospel and leaving others alone and compromising the gospel message and appointing women preachers and defending molehills, as we say, and whether to preach sound doctrine and how to preach it and what are your motivations for preaching. These are all in future lessons. We thank you for listening today and for watching and for being in the class. And until we meet again, may our good Lord bless and keep you. Thank you.